In 1641, a man named John Gowen walked into a Virginia courtroom. He was African. He was a servant. And over years of raising hogs on his master's land, pocketing what he was allowed to keep, he had finally saved up enough to do one thing. He was going to buy his son's freedom. The court record reads plainly, the way old legal documents do when they're describing something extraordinary without realizing it or maybe without caring about it. John Gowen, that's how it was spelled, being a Negro servant unto William Evans, was permitted by his said master to keep hogs and make the best benefit thereof to himself. And then, at the bottom of that entry, there's a second appearance, John producing money, petitioning for his son Michael. And the court said yes. And the name John Gowen passed down to Michael and to Michael's children and to their children after that. These people would spend the next 400 years moving south and west across the American continent, shape-shifting with every census taker who wrote down what he heard. Goen, G-O-W-E-N, became Goin, G-O-I-N. It's in my family tree. Goings, Goen. Different states, different centuries, different spellings, different communities, same family. But by 1724, the Gowen family had moved into Stafford County, Virginia, and they were prosperous enough to have made a powerful enemy. So now we have one name, at least 4 states, at least 4 centuries of connectivity here. But the question is, why? And the answer takes us back to the very beginning of American racial law. You're listening to NYTN, where we talk about American identity and family stories. I'm Danielle Romero. You can find me at patreon.com/NYTN or on YouTube at NYTN. The first thing you need to know about the Melungeons is that nobody agrees on what the word means, and that ambiguity was for a very long time kind of exactly the whole point. The communities most associated with this term live primarily in the Appalachian highlands of East Tennessee, also southwestern Virginia and eastern Kentucky. Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee is where most researchers start, and I'm recording to you as a descendant of the Goens, and I'm currently living in Nashville, Tennessee. We'll get to that later. Now, if you've heard of the Melungeons at all, you've probably heard of Newman's Ridge, and if you haven't, it's a steep, isolated stretch of land where families have been living since at least the early 1800s. By some accounts, much longer. We're not totally sure. And the Melungeons were, by most physical descriptions, a community of people who didn't fit into the white-black binary of the American system. They're dark-skinned, some of them, but not black in the way the law maybe had defined black. They had high cheekbones, often, dark hair, often, not always, right? Eyes that ran toward gray or blue, and their neighbors were mostly Scots-Irish and German settlers who had a legal framework for sorting people out. You're white, you're black, and then Indian became a category too. But the Melungeons kept slipping through these categories. They voted, some of them. They owned property, some of them. They married into white families, some of them. But then the law tightened, and the Melungeons stopped being able to choose. And that's when the last name started to be used as more of a weapon. As for the word Melungeon itself, the origin has been argued over for more than a century. They're Turkish, they're Portuguese. It's a word used for shipmate, it's French, it's Creek. Every theory about what Melungeon means is in some way a theory about maybe where these people came from. And the origin stories the families told about themselves were just as varied, and I would say more important. But they said they were Portuguese. They said they were Cherokee. They said they had lived in the mountains since before the Europeans arrived. They said they were the descendants of Sir Walter Raleigh's lost colony, the ones who disappeared into the interior and never came back. Now, I want to be really careful here because this is where a lot of popular writing about the Melungeons, I think, can go sideways. So the triracial label usually means white, black, Native American that researchers settled on in the 20th century. I think it is useful, but it's also kind of reductive. It is useful because it's probably accurate in the general sense. It matched my family's DNA tests. But it's kind of reductive because I think it flattens out 4 centuries of distinct family histories, different migration routes, different degrees of admixture, different communities that actually developed separate identities, even when they shared surnames. So speaking of surnames, this is where the story gets really interesting. because one name in particular keeps appearing across every version of this community and other communities as well. In Tennessee, in North Carolina, Louisiana, South Carolina, Goins. You find the Goins in the Melungeons of Newman's Ridge. That's a core surname. In the Lumbee of Robeson County, North Carolina, Goins is there too. And a man named Jimmy Goins would eventually serve as the Lumbee tribal chairman and testify before the U.S. Senate in 2007. He was lobbying for federal recognition. You also see in the Redbones of Louisiana, the Brass Ankles of South Carolina. This blew my mind. And when researchers began tracing the paper trail of these communities in the 20th century, they just kept finding the same surnames traveling together. This is like a list of my family tree. Collins, Gibson, Bunch, Harris, Oxidine or Oxidine, Chavez, Chavis, and threaded through nearly all of them, Goins. In 1915, a Goins family in North Carolina took their children's school enrollment to the state Supreme Court. Remember, this is during Jim Crow, okay? The school had said the family had too much Negro blood to attend the Indian school. During the trial, a minister was sent to South Carolina to investigate, okay, great. And when he asked people there about the Goins name, this is what they told him. They said, we're sometimes called Redbones, sometimes we're called Croatans. And then Reverend Locklear, which is another name that comes up, gave his own testimony. He said the plaintiffs were, on the mother's side, Indians, but on the father's side, Melungeons. In a North Carolina courtroom in 1915, this word comes up and it's applied to a family whose neighbors in South Carolina called themselves Redbones. Okay, so now we have one name, at least 4 states, at least 4 centuries of connectivity here. But the question is, why? And the answer takes us back to the very beginning of American racial law. So here's the thing about Melungeons I think doesn't get said enough. The evidence for who they were and are, because this is people still here today, right, identify as Melungeon, has always been in the archives. It was never really hidden. It was just really inconvenient to the system. In 1754, there was a muster roll for the Granville County, North Carolina Militia Regiment under Colonel William Eaton, and it sorted its men into categories the way maybe colonial records would do, right? And under one heading, it listed 3 men together, Thomas Gowen, Michael Gowen, and Edward Gowen, listed as mulattoes. Now, they're separated from the rest of the company roll. Okay, noted. Gotcha. But they are on the roll, which means they showed up, which means they served, which means at least in 1754 in Granville County, being noted as a mulatto in the record didn't disqualify you from bearing arms alongside your white neighbors. Okay, so there's a tension here between the racial category being applied in the paperwork, right, and the actual life being lived on the ground. I would say this is a central tension of not just Melungeon history, but you see this with the tri-racial groups, right? But by 1724, the Gowen family had moved into Stafford County, Virginia, and they were prosperous enough to have made a powerful enemy. And so there's a land dispute case from 1767, and it preserved the testimony. It was so cool. There's a man, I'll put this in the show notes, named Charles Griffith, who had described a conversation he had had with a Major Robert Alexander 43 years earlier. So Griffith had been at a horse race. Okay, the Goings were there, running their own fine horses, spending freely. They've got money. And Major Alexander, whose land adjoined theirs, had muttered within earshot that he had a great mind to, quote, turn the, quote, mulatto rascals off his property. So the old people at that race, Griffith is testifying, were saying that the Goings had taken up Alexander's land and sold it, and that if it wasn't for Alexander's land, the Goings would, quote, not be so lavish of their money, of which they seemed to have plenty, unquote. So that scene, we have these free mixed-race men at a Virginia horse race in 1724. They're running horses, they're flush with cash, they are prosperous enough to draw resentment. This is a scene that gets, I think, edited out of the Melungeon story. Because the popular story, and it's true in part, is about isolation, about maybe ridge-dwelling people cut off from the world, but the actual records show families who were still very much in the world, acquiring land, serving in militias, sitting on juries, and even running horses at county races. The isolation came later. And the isolation was, in many ways, imposed from the outside. And nothing makes that more clear than what happened in Claiborne County, Tennessee, in 1853. Thomas Gowen, Old Tommy as his neighbors called him, had been dead for 15 years by then. It's reading like a Charles Dickens story. but his reputation was still very much alive. His grandson Elijah was a grown man, a member of his community, a man who had voted. He actually had held local office and done all the things that Tennessee law said a free white citizen could do. And then a neighbor named Sterling Mayse decided to say out loud what everyone apparently was believing privately in their head. Now, these words were recorded in the court documents. You know how much I love primary sources. It said a witness named John Brogan testified that he had heard Mayse sing a song, quote, Negro ditty, unquote, he had performed for Elijah on the streets of Tazewell. And part of it went like this. Elijah Goen, being a little blacker, he ran up and down the creek like a damn mulatto. Now, I don't know, it didn't really rhyme or anything, but Mayse had said his children should call Elijah a Negro and he would protect them in it. Another witness, William Robinson, testified that, quote, it was generally reported and believed that the plaintiff was mixed-blooded, that old Tommy Gowen, the grandfather of the plaintiff, was reputed to be mixed-blooded, unquote. Elijah sued him for slander. What makes the Elijah Gowen versus Sterling Mayse case so extraordinary is not just the slander angle itself, okay? It's what the testimony reveals about how this community had been functioning for decades. So witness after witness took the stand and said some version of this same thing. Yes, old Tommy was reputed to be mixed. Yes, everyone knew it. And then they said the other part. A man named Peter Markham testified that he had known old Tommy Gowen since the 1800s and that he was, quote, reputed to be distantly mixed-blooded, and that Tommy had, quote, voted, served on juries, and was examined as a witness between white men, never heard him questioned or denied, unquote. So he was saying, yes, he may have been mixed, but for 50 years, this guy wasn't really questioned about his involvement in his community. And what Sterling Mayse was doing, I don't think he was trying to reveal a secret, but I do think he was attempting to revoke a status that the community had extended to the Goens family across multiple generations. They had a status of someone whose mixed ancestry was known, but it wasn't negatively acted upon because the family had made themselves useful. They're respectable. They're successful. And so Elijah won his case, and the jury awarded him $50 in damages. Mayse appealed to the Tennessee Supreme Court, which reversed the verdict, but it didn't reverse it on the question of Elijah's ancestry, but it was, as far as I can tell, and I'll put the link in the show notes, on a technicality about the legal definition of a mulatto and civil disabilities. So, long story short, the court essentially said, you can call someone a mulatto if that's what your neighbors believe, as long as you're not trying to strip them of their rights. Wow, right? Wow. You can call someone a mulatto. This is the Tennessee Supreme Court. If that's the community's reputation for them, not if it's true, right? Not if they identify as that, as long as you're not seeking to take their rights away. Wow. So I think that tells you a little bit about how racial law was working in the antebellum South. This is kind of a negotiation, and that negotiation is what the Melungeons, they had been winning for generations, especially the Goens family. But that was becoming increasingly difficult to win as the law hardened toward the Civil War. So here's where the science catches up to the history. Let's jump to that. In 2006, a descendant of old Tommy's son, Uriah, submitted a Y-DNA sample to a genealogical testing project. And I'll look for where that was in the show notes. I'll put it in there. But the result had come back haplogroup E3A. This is the most common haplogroup among men of African descent. It matched a second confirmed descendant of Thomas Gowen and matched to another named William Gowen, born 1771, North Carolina. So we had three men from three different branches of the family spelling their last name three different ways. They all had this same deeper origin. And then in 1882, someone in Randolph County, North Carolina, did something remarkable. They've recorded a genealogy directly into a deed book. It wasn't a church record or letter or something tucked into a Bible. It was a legal document, witnessed and filed, and it describes a man named Daniel Goens, and it reads in part, his great-grandmother, Elizabeth Goens, was white. His grandfather, William Goens, was mixed, and it's M-I-X-T is how he wrote it. His grandmother, Patsy Petty, was white. His father, Sandy Murchison, was white. His mother, Leah Goens, was slightly mixed, making Daniel Goens very slightly mixed, passed into the white race to the third generation at least. Okay, so someone sat down and tried to do the math. We talk about this on my podcast a lot. on my videos, the math of blackness. We're talking fraction by fraction, generation by generation, recorded into a deed book so Daniel Goins could prove legally that he was white enough. That is the world our families were navigating. That is what the records show you when you look at these without flinching at words like mulatto and Negro and things like that when we're looking at what the experience was at the time. So what happened? Well, the Melungeons didn't become mysterious because they were mysterious. They became mysterious because mystery was safer than the alternative. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'm painting with a broad brush here. But the racial categories that American law built itself around were not descriptions of biological reality. Okay, these are legal tools. We talk about this all the time. The one-drop rule, the idea that any traceable African ancestry made a person legally black, that did not exist from the beginning. This is something that evolved and it was hardening through the 18th and 19th centuries, becoming more rigid as slavery became more economically central to the South in particular, and as the stakes of this category are rising. But before the law hardened, you did have communities like the ones we've been talking about, families who occupied that middle ground. They're legally ambiguous. That's okay. They survived by being useful. Think about that pressure, right? And still impossible to easily classify, but people were mostly okay with that. But after the law hardened, that middle ground became a liability. So the Melungeons did what people do when the ground shifts beneath them, right? You tell new stories. You say you're Portuguese, you're Cherokee. They are reaching for identities that maybe they were safer in the area they were in. Maybe they were just more defensible in a courtroom. We are sometimes called Redbones, sometimes called Croatans. Every name, in my opinion, was a survival strategy for the time and place that family lived. And here's the thing that I think also gets missed when we're talking about the popular treatments of this community. I don't think these stories were lies. I think they were compressions. The Melungeons who are saying they're Portuguese, I think they're describing real ancestry. I had a bunch of Portuguese show up on my mom's side, no idea it was there. And the Africans who arrived in Virginia in 1619 came from Angola, which was a Portuguese colony. And I think, I might be wrong here, but if my memory serves me, that would make them technically Portuguese subjects. They had been baptized by Jesuit priests. They may have spoken Portuguese. They understood Portuguese law. And so when their descendants 200 years later are saying we are Portuguese, or Portuguese is what is normally seen on the documents, I think they were just collapsing 4 centuries of history into a single legally useful claim, right? The same with Cherokee. Until that wasn't good, right? That's too much for this podcast right now. But the same with every other origin story. These aren't inventions or lies. I would say they were editing part of the story that could be said out loud, so it wouldn't cost you your land or your vote or your children's place in the schoolhouse, and it did not always work. So what American genealogy is doing now, like amazing researchers who've been in this field like Beverly, Nelson, Jack Gowen, who I believe has just passed away, Virginia DeMarce, and dozens of others have been doing this for the last 40 years. I just turned 40 a few weeks ago. They did it before I was born. They have been doing what I would call unediting the story. Going back to the deed books and the court records and the church rolls and the DNA and reading what was actually there and folding that in with what people said about themselves. These are people who navigated an impossible system with extraordinary skill for an extraordinary long time. And the fact that the Melungeon identity survived, that the Goens family survived, that you can find them in these records at all, to me, is the evidence of that. So if you have Goens in your family tree, if you're from the South, I bet you have a Goens in your family tree. Let me just say that. Or from Virginia. Any spelling, any state, you have pulled a thread that leads somewhere so real. And your job now is to follow it into the specific records. What county, what decade, what church, what neighbors. Because the name alone is not an answer for us, right? Some people stop at that and that's fine. But to me, I'm going to encourage you, that name is a door. And the tools for walking through that door, how to read the racial designations in historical records, how to navigate court documents and deed books where mixed heritage families actually left traces of the story, how to understand what the DNA is telling you and not telling you, that is all inside my Patreon. And so if you would like to go deeper, I'm doing podcasts once a week. You get an episode a week early if you're a paid patron. There are behind the scenes research. You can see live conversations with me. I have video content that doesn't make it into the RSS feed. And that's all at patreon.com/NYTN. I'll put the link in the show notes, along with citations for all the sources I referenced today, because it was a ton. John Gowen, he walked into that courtroom with everything he had, and he asked for his son back. And I would say 400 years later, his descendants are still asking to be found. Go find yours. I'm Danielle Romero, and I'll see you soon.